So what we're going to end up using now is we really have, we've got our layout set up. What we want to do is we want to deal with data in our application. And one of the common ways to deal with data, or another way of saying that is state, is by using a library called Redux. And not just Redux, but also using React Redux. So there's a couple of things we're going to end up needing to do here. Let's go over here, and I'm going to say npm install Redux. And also, there's some other things that we're going to need for that end up connecting React to Redux. So there's two libraries that I'm going to end up needing. And I'm going to say save. And so in order to end up using Redux in your application, what you actually need to do is you need to have a store, because your store is where your data lives. It's really a Redux store. So I'm going to do an import here. And I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to end up bringing in something called the provider from, and this is going to be from React.Redux. Okay? What this provider does is that it's basically going to give, our store is going to be available from anywhere within our application. And in order to do that, I'm going to go and put this provider tag here, wrap it around our routes. And if I just did this, and I run this again, and I go over here, this should build. Took a little while, but it built. And I'm going to go over here to this page. And I'll end up getting an error message. And the error message that I have is to say, hey, look, if you want a provider, you've got to provide a store. Okay, because that's what the provider does, is it's looking for a store that ends up getting passed. So again, things end up getting passed in your React application through properties. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to say store equals store. Again, this doesn't exist, so I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to say import store from /store. Doesn't exist. Let's go and create it. Now, there's nothing that prevents me from saying const store equals some empty object and saying export default store. I could do that. I could end up getting away with that. But if I end up rerunning this, it'll specify, look, you got a little bit of a problem because you do have a store, but a store basically needs to do a couple of different things. One of the things you need to be able to do is to subscribe to the store. Again, these aren't things that you're going to have to do, but this is sort of the inner workings of how Redux works. The problem is I don't have a valid Redux store. So let's go over here and start to set up our store. And we'll have a little work that's being done here. And this is where we're going to end up bringing in Redux. And if I go over here, I'll say import create store from Redux. So I want to end up creating this store from Redux. If I went over here and I just said const store equals create store, and I sent this back, okay, I might think that I'm in pretty good shape, but if I went back here, I get an error message because what it's telling me here is that the store is really made up of a reducer, okay, or a combination of reducers. Reducers are simplistically a way that specifies that state ends up changing. within your application. So if I were to go over here, and let's actually set up sort of a simplistic reducer. I'm going to go over here and I'll specify that const users reducer. And a reducer is nothing more than a function that has a very specific signature. Okay? So a reducer takes two things. A state, call that really anything you want to call it, since our state is going to be a collection of users. Again, this reducer is going to manage our collection of users. I could call this users. Okay? And it's in my best interest to give this a default value and then also specify an action. Okay? So if I was to go over here, and usually in the end here, we would end up returning users, but more than likely I'm going to have some switch statement here, action.type, and I'm going to specify that a case, I'm going to say if my case is init, and I'll say user because we could have different reducers that are being initiated. Okay? So I'm going to say init user, this is basically for my user object. So I'll say for case user, what I'm going to end up doing here is I'm going to say users equals, and again, if my action here is going to be loading users, I better be passing new users that end up getting loaded. So a big thing when you're looking at reducer, a couple of different things. Number one, you never mutate your state. Okay? Notice I'm reassigning users if I end up calling this. If not, I'm going to end up having an empty array. Okay? Also, there's no side effects. Anything you see in your reducer, there could be some logic that's there, but there's not going to be anything asynchronous. It's going to be purely, hey, look, this is the action. If this was my state before, and this is my action, this is what I expect my state to be after. Okay? So for instance, if we were to go over here and specify, we could put a couple of these here. We could say case, and this is going to be create user. So if we have a type for create user, let me put a break here too, so that this doesn't, the other ones don't get hit. Now, something that's important, I don't want to do something like this, users.push. And again, if I'm creating a user, I better be passing the user that I'm creating. Again, this assumes if anything is happening on your back end, it's happening somewhere else. Your reducers are plain, they're synchronous, they're incredibly predictable. Okay? I guess they could be more complicated, but this would be bad because I'm mutating my state. Okay? Redux doesn't like when you mutate your state, so an easy thing to do, and there are other ways to do this, but if we use our little ES6 goodness, we could specify that what we really want to do, and this is kind of cool, this is called the spread operator. And what it does is basically takes your array of users and spreads them out. Okay? So it's like you basically took them apart to a new array, and now we add to this our action.user. Okay? And that's going to be our new users object. So just as an aside here, if I were to go over here and say console.log store get state, and I go to rerun this, and let's make sure that I set this up correctly. So now, when I create my store, I'm going to give it my users reducer. Okay? Notice this is an empty array. And notice if I went and I said, hey, like store, do me a favor, store, I'm going to dispatch to you, because that's what you can do with a store. I'm going to dispatch to you. And what I'm going to end up doing, stores basically get dispatched actions. They have an initial state. Our initial state is going to be this empty array. And I'm going to dispatch to you a type of init user. And I'll give this an array just for the sake of argument. So users is going to be what I'll put on here. And I'll give this an array, just for the sake of argument. These aren't really users. This is just a bunch of numbers. And if I go over here and I end up dispatching this method, and I run it again, I'll see that this is what my state is. And just as an aside, if I went over here, and my type is to create a user, again, different types take different action arguments. So here, this would be a user. And let's say my user is going to be 7. So now you can see that gets added here as well. Now, again, ideally, there's a couple of things here. First of all, I've got a little bit of an issue here. And one of the issues is that right now the entire state of my application, again, you only have one Redux store. Okay? So maybe I want to have users in my application. Maybe I want to have posts in my application. Maybe I want to have pages in my application. It'd be great if I could end up looking at my reducer and say the users is an empty array, but I could have other things that are part of my store as well. So let's break this out a little bit. What we're going to do here is I'm going to move this users reducer. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to create a folder called Redux. And I'll go over here and I'll say this is going to be my users reducer.js. And I'm going to end up pasting this users reducer here. And I'll say export default users reducer. Okay? And I might have multiple reducers that are in my application that I want to be able to combine. Okay? Again, reducers, very simple, not really much more than a function with a bunch of switch statements. But if I end up doing that, then one of the things I could do is I could go in here and I could put an index file here. And what I actually want to do here is I want to import, I want to basically have a number of reducers. So I'm going to go over here and I'll say, well, I want to import users reducer from, and I'm in this folder already, users reducer. Okay? I'm also going to import combine reducers, and this is just from Redux. So Redux gives you the ability to combine reducers, and I'll go over here and I'll say constant, my combined reducers are going to be, and I'm going to go and I'm going to call this combine reducers, and I'm going to, what it needs to get are a couple of different things. It says, well, what do you want me, you have different reducers, you want them to be in charge of different parts of your state, and I'll specify that in the case of users, okay, we're going to end up using, and this needs to be an object, because you could have multiple reducers. So I'm calling this method combined reducers, and I'll say for users, I'm going to use my users reducer. Again, to control different slices of the state. Again, reducers control state. I could end up combining them, and I could say export default, and this is going to be my combined reducers. What that's going to allow me to do is now go back to my store, and I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to say create store, and I'm going to say import, I'll just call it reducer from /Redux. So it'll automatically go and get that index file, and that's going to be my combined reducer, and a store only needs a reducer. And the only difference here, if I go and look at it, all these are valid actions that can be called on your store. If I go over here, and this runs, notice now things are a little bit different, right? So notice with that, again, different states end up getting impacted by using different reducers, right? So now I've got these reducers in my application. Now I want to make one modification to this. So one of the things that we might want to do with our application is that when our application ends up loading, what I'm going to do over here, I'm going to end up bringing into my store. Maybe this is not the best place for it, but it's okay. I'm going to create a function called fetch users. Okay? And I'm going to end up fetching users from, and I'm going to go up here and I'm going to go to my Redux folder, users reducer. Okay? Now this doesn't exist at the moment, but if it did end up existing, I'm going to go over here to my users reducer and I'll say export the constant fetch users. Okay? And what this is going to be is a function. Now, what's going to be interesting about this function is that what I really want to have this function do is that when this function ends up getting called, what I want to end up doing is I want to end up making a call to get the users from my server. So the way that I'm going to end up sort of setting that up is that if I went over here, let's imagine, well, let's say that this fetch users is a function, and I'm going to put this on multiple lines. So what I'm going to end up doing here is this is going to be something that's asynchronous. Okay? So I'm going to end up returning from this function another function. I'm going to end up returning from this function another function. Now, what will end up happening here? If I just ended up doing this, let's just for the moment do this. Let's just say that this was this fetch users was a function. If I was to go back here and I end up exporting that, let's go over here and let's just say, for the sake of argument, we're going to go back here to our store. So we brought in fetch users, and we're going to say, hey, look, store.dispatch fetch users. I'm going to call this function that I ended up pulling out. So if we go and do that, what will end up happening here is that it'll tell us, hey, look, if you end up calling an action, that action has to basically be a simple object, okay? Because reducers are very simple, okay? They're simple objects with a type and an action. The second you want to do something asynchronous, okay, you have to put in middleware. And what will happen with middleware is that when you call dispatch, okay, and you end up passing it a function, what will end up happening is that that function will end up getting called, okay, with the dispatcher. You could then do something asynchronously, and then when you're ready to dispatch your simple object, you have the ability to do it, okay? Again, you can really only dispatch simple objects, but what we're going to end up doing here, and I know this feels like a little bit of a stretch here, but let's get rid of that error message. And the way that we're going to end up getting rid of this error message is that we're going to go and configure our store. So one of the things that we could end up doing to our store is that our store we could actually put in middleware. And the way that we're going to do it is that there's a function apply middleware. Same way that Express has middleware. What middleware are we going to use? Well, there's a middleware called Thunk. Again, and there's a couple of them, a couple of other ones as well. We're going to end up bringing in Thunk, and this is from something called Redux Thunk. And what we're going to do here is our store is not only going to have these reducers, but we're also going to say, hey, look, we want to use the apply middleware, and we want you to use Thunk. This is going to allow us to have asynchronous dispatches. Again, in the end, we're going to need simple objects, but it's going to let us delay when the dispatch ends up getting called. Okay, so let's actually go back here and kill this. npm install Redux thunk save. And npm run start dev. Now if I go back here, this should no longer end up throwing an error, but nothing really is going to be happening here. So what I really want to do here, so the nice thing about this is that this is going to allow me to have an action that looks more like this. So if this function returns another function, this will end up getting passed. It'll look and it'll see, hey, look, fetch users is a function. Okay, I'm going to call that function and I'm going to pass the dispatch to you to allow you to dispatch, but only when you're ready. All right, and what we're going to end up doing here is we'll go up here and we're going to want to make Ajax calls, and a nice library to make simple Ajax calls is going to be something called Axios. From Axios. It's a lot simpler than using jQuery. And let's go back over here. Install Axios, save. And we've got our endpoint already set up. So when we go to dispatch, we're going to say, Axios, I want you to get API users. And then when you're done, we're going to have a result. And what do I want you to do with the result? Well, when you end up getting the result, I'm going to end up dispatching. Okay? And what am I going to end up dispatching? Well, I'm going to dispatch a type of init user. And my users are going to be my result.data, which is sort of standard for an Ajax call. Now, again, this is not going to mean all that much to us right now, but the only thing that we're going to find out here is that if we end up going and rerunning this, let's actually say npm run start dev. We go over here, we'll find out that there should be a call, even though nothing's happening with it, that's going to our server, that's getting us our empty collection of users. So I want to take a break here. This is Redux. Again, this is something that only has to sort of be set up once. The idea that you're setting up the middleware, because again, reducers are very simplistic. Here we want to basically have asynchronous reducers, and we end up doing that through middleware. Again, whatever ends up getting dispatched, even though it looks like we're dispatching something that's asynchronous, it's not getting dispatched yet. It's only getting dispatched here, right? So these are second order functions. It looks, again, it's not that complicated. In the dispatch method, it says what you pass me. If you pass me a function, I'll call it and I'll send the dispatcher. If I just get back a regular object, I'm going to run it through all my reducers that I have that are combined. Okay? Let me stop